Hello, welcome. My name is Ron Middlehammer. I'm the director of the School of Economic Sciences here at Washington State University. The School of Economic Sciences would like to welcome you to this year's Bertha C. and Roy E. Lai Distinguished Lecture in Economics. First of all, we'd like to thank Dwayne and Joan Lai and the entire Lai family for their continued support and sponsorship of their Distinguished Lecture Series. Unfortunately, the Lais cannot be here tonight because the weather has prevented them from driving here from Oregon. This year we are pleased and honored to have with us Professor James Heckman, the Henry Schultz Distinguished Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago and Nobel Laureate in Economics. Professor Heckman received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2000 for his pioneering work in selection bias and self-selection analysis. His research has been devoted to the development of a scientific basis for economic policy evaluation. In the course of his work, he has made contributions to economic theory and to econometrics, and is renowned for his empirical research in labor economics and particularly the efficacy of early childhood education programs. His talk this evening is entitled Schools, Skills, and Synapses, the short title, and I'm privileged to present to you Professor James Heckman.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be invited to give this lecture. Dwayne, I've known Dwayne for years. I'm very sorry he can't be here, and I certainly learned from him, and so I'm very happy to come back tonight and give this lecture. So let me talk about the lecture, and this is a lecture which does combine a number of elements in my work and in areas in social science. So let me start with a statement which I think is accurate, but is something which we don't fully appreciate. And that is that the accident of birth is the greatest source of inequality in the U.S. labor market. There's a lot of talk about inequality and what the source is. I think it comes from the accident of birth. And what I want to show you tonight is that American society is actually becoming more polarized, not just by income, but also by education. There's been a lot of talk about the fact that certain corporate executives are getting excess compensation, that maybe we want to reformulate the tax system and so forth. But I think that misses some of the real core sources of inequality in American society. To me, the major problem that's emerged is at a time when the skills are at a premium, when education is really at the high, when the rate of return to education, the economic return to education is increased. What we've seen in the U.S. economy is a reduction in the growth of supply of high-skilled workers. Never mind immigrants. This has nothing really to do with immigration. That's another source. But that's not the issue. The issue is really that even within the native population born in the U.S., an underclass of high school dropouts is actually emerging. Now let me show you some facts, which many of you are familiar with, but it's useful to keep them in mind. If we go over time and we look at what the change is of the wage of a high school dropout to a high school graduate, we see that over the course of 1963 to 2000, there's been a 15% decline in the real wages. This was actually more intense in the period 1979 to 1987. But in the last 20, 30 years, there's been actually a decline in the real income of high school dropouts. And if we look at the wages of high school dropouts compared to college graduates, it's even more extreme. We're getting a 40% growth. So in real income terms, over many of these periods, the wages of high school graduates, high school dropouts, were actually declining. And that's an important fact to keep in mind, because in the American economy, we're actually producing more high school dropouts, well-kept secret. So despite the growth in the return to skill, and an economic argument would tell you we should have more, if the price goes up, usually more of it's supplied because it's scarce. There's been a slowdown in the growth of the supply of skill. So here's a graph taken from a paper published a couple years ago by Otter, Katz, and Kearney in the American Economic Review. And it shows an important and somewhat depressing phenomenon. I want to come back to this. But what we've seen is around 1980s was the time when the return to college education went up. So the skill premium went up. And this has been a secular phenomena found in many countries around the world. And so and historically, what we found is that each year the economy was getting more skilled, and the rate of growth was following a fairly linear trend, say up to 1980. Then it starts to slow down. It's increasing, but the rate of increase is slowing down. And so that's a strange phenomenon, especially since the return is speeding up. I'll skip this graph, it's a little too busy, but what it's really saying is that demand price and supply are not keeping up. So the question is, why the slowdown in supply? And that's a huge policy question. It's a policy question that many people ignore and I think is essential. And I think the first thing to understand is a little bit of accounting, that the slowdown in the rate of growth of college attendance is not due to the rate of growth of college attendance among graduates. That's the first exhibit. See, in social policy, I'm sure at every election you've heard, I'm sure even in the presidential election coming up in next year, you're going to see a lot of discussion about the fact that tuition rates are too high. I'm sure many of you in this room would agree with that. That in fact that there are serious problems in the financing of college education. But I want to argue tonight that that's a fairly small effect, that relative to what the real causes are of the slowdown, that's a second order effect. What I want to argue is that one of the reasons why we're not increasing our college graduation rate and why the skills of the labor force are actually declining is the growth in high school dropout rates. And that's an important finding. So let me just show you something that should be surprising to you. And it was surprising to me. I have a new paper on this subject, and I think it's quite important. But if we look, for example, at the American high school dropout rate, this figure that you see at the bottom is the rate that's essentially, I should use the pointer here, I guess. If you look at the bottom of this graph up to 1980, what you see is individuals starting from 1900, that the college attendance rate, whoops, what did I do here? I skipped past this. Yes, how did I do that so quickly? This is the official dropout rate. Suddenly I was changing gears. This is the official dropout rate, and it looks very optimistic. It's suggesting that if you look, and this is something that comes out from the Department of Labor and the official statistics, National Center for Educational Statistics, that the high school dropout rate is declining. And in fact, the official dropout rate is now just barely above 10%, being at around 15%. So we look at the years 67 through 2000, there has been an improvement. But what I would argue is the official rate actually disguises some real social problems. That the correct dropout rate has actually been increasing over this period. And this is due to a phenomenon, which I don't want to get into too much, but I'll talk about a little bit more in the lecture tonight, and that is that we've seen a phenomenal growth in something called GEDs. These are exam-certified dropouts who get certification by taking a test, but not graduating high school in the usual way. Currently in the United States, 1 out of every 5 certificates issued for high school certification is basically given to a GED. The GED is the largest single high school in America. And now the reason why I would not count the GEDs as high school graduates is actually they perform at the rate of dropouts. There are a few successful GEDs, but most GEDs are not earning anywhere near, not performing anywhere near the high school graduation rate. So that's Exhibit A, but it shows in fact that we have a serious problem. So the dropout rate is increasing. I would argue, I've written some papers on this, I'm happy to talk more about it, but really if you look at the correct dropout rate, what we're finding is that we're closer to 30%, not the low 11%, and it's increasing. And remember, it's